Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a more fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. Welcome to ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. Today on the show, we have Augusto Pinaud, Art Gelwicks, and Francis Wade. Welcome, everybody. How's it going?
Good morning.
It's going great.
Oh, it's going great. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. So excited to have everybody on for this recording because we're talking about getting unstuck. I wanted to lead off with just what we all are thinking about when we talk about getting stuck in the first place and how and what that means in the context of productivity. Art had come up with a really great suggestion, which is that at the end of the episode, we're each going to rapid fire give some of our own sort of tactical techniques for our, sort of our quick tactics for being able to get unstuck when we ourselves get stuck. So we will close out the episode with that. But let's start with just your thoughts on what is getting stuck and what is getting unstuck then as its inverse.
I found myself stuck in a serious way when I moved back to Jamaica from living in the US. All of a sudden, I was unproductive, whereas I used to be productive. I used to lead, before I moved back, I used to lead time management programs, and I thought I had my stuff together. And I moved into an environment that was way more hectic than I expected, way more dramatic, way less predictable, people way less trustworthy in terms of what they could deliver. And I was totally at sea. It was totally disconcerting, and I couldn't get anything done. I went looking on the internet for answers and couldn't find anything. I had way more to do because I was doing other people's jobs for them, and I had no idea how to cope. Things were flying through the cracks, and it was as if I couldn't remember to do anything that I needed to do.
And for the people who have never read those posts of Francis, it has always been an internal joke, or at least for me, between Francis and I from the outside instead enjoy reading those posts incredibly. I was born and raised in Venezuela, so I went the other way as Francis went. I learned productivity in a place where it was completely unpredictable, where getting to a meeting and the person who gives you the meeting decide not to show up, and where predictability was almost non-existent. So when I moved to the United States, for me happened exactly the opposite. It was like, oh, great. So all these tools that I've been using for years now make sense. And over the years, they have evolved and changed. But I was always feeling more stuck before I moved here than when I moved. And of course, that changed, and I've been stuck and unstuck multiple times. And actually just yesterday that this topic came, pretty timely, and we were privately joking via text messages because as I was doing my weekly review, I noticed that I had 963 tasks, okay? And that is, for me, the definition of stuck, because the reality is there's no way for me to tackle 10% of that on a day. So that means even if I have a really productive day, it's going to feel as if I did nothing. And the question is, what you do after that? And I will answer that through the episode, but that's a question I want to leave open today.
For me, stuck is usually one of two things. It's either I've got things pulling me in all different directions. You get this mental image of an object with ropes tied to it, pulling in all different directions, and the object doesn't move because everything's pulling equally but in different directions. But also the kind of the lack of knowing exactly what the next step will be to get me back on track for a particular thing. And not knowing that often will push me into a direction for something else, leaving me stuck on that particular item. And it's easy to confuse stuck and procrastination. I don't think that they're completely separate, but I also don't think they're completely equal too. One can feed the other. But I do want to take 5 seconds, though, here, and I want to congratulate Francis's Jamaican soccer team on their incredible upset win last night in the Gold Cup. So now that I'm done with that.
Not an upset. It was kind of expected, right?
Now that's what I like to hear. That's what I like to hear.
I made a note here as we were preparing for the show, and I wrote down procrastination because I think I'm pretty much on the same page here with Art, which is to say that I see being stuck in and being sort of a fork in the road. And one is avoidance, and the other is sort of lack of resources or limitation of resources of some kind, whether that be mental, physical, time, energy, money, whatever it might be. The reality is that sense of avoidance, that lack of resources, causes some kind of stymieing of your personal productivity. And I think that the end result is the outgrowth of that becomes procrastination, overwhelm, distraction, all of those kinds of things. That there is a deeper reason for procrastination, for overwhelm, for those kinds of things, and I believe it's the getting stuckness that actually does that. So it's a little bit of a tangential piece there. I think that getting unstuck means, for most people, finding the resource, being resourceful, or committing. Commitment is really the answer, the key to me in a lot of ways to what unstuck means, and maybe we'll talk about that and have a little bit of rhetoric around that concept once we get moving a little bit further on. But I really do think that a lot of it comes to this idea of avoidance. It's a fear-based response, I think, being stuck, and the answer is light to darkness. You have to shine a light on it and choose this sort of leaning into the positive.
I think there's a common sort of framework here. I think people start feeling stuck when they have symptoms they can't get rid of. So, like you have too much email, or you're always late, or you're feeling overwhelmed, or you wake up in the middle of the night and there's stuff that you need to do and you're just remembering it all of a sudden. But there's a common set of symptoms that human beings who are trying to be productive sometimes face. We get stuck when we can't sort them out. In other words, we can't figure out the root cause, so we don't know what to do. They go from being acute to being chronic. And in my work, I've had to separate psychological causes from behavioral causes. And it's just the difference between having, let's call it a mental block, versus a block in terms of behavior. Because a lot of the problems that I see, because I focus on behaviors, have to do with people who are highly motivated but still get stuck anyway. So they have the right mindset, but that doesn't help them because they don't know what to do, or if they know what to do, they don't know how to execute it. So I think the causes fall into two buckets: psychological causes or behavioral causes. That's my point of view.
I don't know if there are two or it's more like a 50 shades of gray, and I hope that doesn't mark our podcast as explicit, but sorry, the joke needed to come out.
Go ahead.
I think, I remember when the first time I read Getting Things Done by David Allen, I was finally evolving from an entry-level perspective to a more middle management position. And there is a couple of things I remember from that time. I don't remember if it was on that famous GTD Fast CDs or the book, to be honest with you, where it came. But I remember he mentioned that there are periods where he was planning like crazy, and then periods where he was doing like crazy. Okay? And I have experimented over the years, moments where my system simply stopped working. Okay? It has nothing to do with the system. It's not that I'm doing anything different. It's not that I'm not doing my weekly review or collecting or anything. It's just this system has been outgrown. The context that used to work don't work anymore. The way certain things are doing is not working anymore. And in my life, those are being massive moments of stuckness, assuming that's something you say in English. And the reason is simple. It's not necessarily that you are avoiding the stuff, even that you are to a certain spot because you cannot find them. It's really that you have the lack of resources because you outgrown your system. And it takes a time to get to certain points to say, okay, this is what the system is. I wish to tell you that when that happened, and that has probably happened every 3 to 5 years in my case, okay, I then stop and go into this great time of thinking how I'm going to solve the issue of the system. In practice, what has happened is actually what is happening right now is I hit myself to the wall enough times until I say, oh, yeah, I need to change this, okay? And then eventually I hit myself more to the wall, and finally I decide it's time to change it to something that actually works.
Yeah, that's you're right on target with this. I mean, I'm writing notes furiously as we go through this because it just keeps me revisiting to a couple of the challenges that I'm literally running into right now. You mentioned that your system stopped working. I ran into this a week ago, and I still haven't gotten over being stuck on this particular issue. The tool I use for task tracking just is not cutting it for me anymore. And I finally figured out why. It's one aspect of the tool that just really isn't doing it for me anymore. So I'm kind of stuck on, well, what do? Do I stay with the tool because it's not really that big of a feature, but it seems to be the one that drives me? Do I move? Do I change it? And it couples to the second part of that there's something missing. In this case, it's information. I haven't gone through the analysis to really decide what's going to be the end result. Sometimes the thing that's missing can be information, it can be resource, it can be material item, it can be something. There's a delay that's introduced outside of my control that kind of locks me into place. And what I haven't done in those situations is planned my way around it, found the second route through the map to get to my end destination because there's construction on the road I was planning to take. So when I think about the getting stuck part of this and how do we get around this, I have to go back to those key drivers again. Taking a moment to say, okay, am I doing this consciously? Am I intentionally staying in this spot? Or is this being forced on me? And if it's being forced on me, what's forcing it on me and how do I move that? That seems to be the hard part.
I think you make some really great points, Art, in terms of the external or internal factors that lead to stuckness, right? To feeling like you're stuck. And for me, most of my limitations end up being internal. I want to do so many things. I have my hand in a lot of different projects at any given time, and when I do any forward planning, I always presume that my eyes are bigger than my stomach, and yet I get to the buffet table of life, and I'm still gorging myself and not capable of digesting very well, by the way. And so I think that's where I become most stuck, is when I recognize the fact that I don't have 27 or 32 hours in a day. I only have the same 24, and of that, 8 needs to be in bed sleeping, and there are other obligations that get taken up in that time frame. So I feel the sense of resource limitation, and I think there's a good side and a bad side to that everybody has to sort of take into account. I genuinely live life with a sense of joie de vivre. I don't have the sense of foreboding because I have those limitations. I really do value the fact that somewhat of the getting stuck process and getting unstuck is just sort of the messiness of being a highly productive person. And so I do approach this from a fairly positive psychology perspective, which is to say that there needs to be some ups for there to be downs, and you need to make sure that you are aware of that fact.
I think there is an important element of what we are discussing, and it comes in particular to me. Okay, and one is then you go, as we were discussing a little bit early, is it looks like avoidance, and in part it is avoidance because I don't know how to solve the problem. I don't even understand the problem, and I feel I don't have the time to solve the problem. But also, it's part of lack of resources because obviously the reason I break the system and it stopped working is because I did not have the right resources in place. As Art says, he's going through that. I'm going through that. Even recently, I have been in OmniFocus since the first version of OmniFocus. Okay, and it's been the system for up and down. And I had a similar thing as Art has, where there was a couple of things that were frustrating me. So I decided, you know what? I've been in this system for way too many years. Let's move on. So I did a research, clean up, move home, okay, get to the new house, play in the new house for 30 days, and move back to OmniFocus. Why? Because even that there is a couple of limitations, when I moved to the other house, I discovered the benefits outgrown the limitations. When I moved to the other place in a beautiful platform, okay, it solved that little issue, but it then created a bunch of other issues that I wasn't willing to deal with. So it is hard because in order to solve sometimes these issues, you need to let it go bad enough so the problem is obvious enough. And as I remember I used to have a computer online and computer offline. Why? Well, because when I started this one, traveling with the computer doesn't necessarily mean I was connected. I travel a lot to Latin America at that time where Wi-Fi was not easy to find. I travel with a long Ethernet cable so I could plug it into the wall and still get to the bed into my hotel room. So all those things changed really without me noticing. Okay, and suddenly my offline list was getting longer without any reason. And the reason was simple. I was getting internet everywhere, so I was opening that. And it took me longer than maybe it should to discover what the problem was. Oh, the problem is I'm always online. The problem is, I used to have a computer list because that makes sense, because there were things that I could do in the computer. When the iPad entered my environment, that computer line was completely buried because I could go from the iPhone to the iPad and back and do almost everything I needed to do. So in a way, everything in my world turned at anywhere. Okay. The problem is when you put everything on anywhere, now you cannot find the stuff in the list because your list is way too long. And all those moments, what I've been feeling is that feeling of a stuck. Yes, I've been avoiding. Yes, I have the lack of resources to discover how to. And sadly, for me, I wish to say it's different, but for me, I need to let this problem sometimes grow, not consciously, until then the reason or the issue that is generating this problem is so obvious that I cannot ignore it anymore. So it gets so big that I finally see the elephant in the room.
So as we switch gears, I wanted to start off with you, Art, because you said that your being stuck right now was conditional on this particular feature, and of your task manager, if you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on what that is and what your process has been in getting unstuck. I mean, what has been going on, even if it's still in kind of real time here for you. What has been your process in identifying what this specific feature was that was present or missing, that is in the task manager, and what you're trying to do, sort of going as you're moving yourself forward and through this?
The challenge I have is actually it's a bit of a strange one. The tool I use for my task tracking, and I've used it for, almost 9 months now, is Todoist. And Todoist is a fantastic task tracking tool. It gives you great structure, great integration, great capability, and it has one neat feature in it called Karma, which allows you to keep track of completion of tasks by earning what they call karma points, and you actually go up in rankings, in their little internal rankings, by completing things. And that's nice from a gamification standpoint. But they'll also take karma points away from you if things that are scheduled drag on, which I always thought was a really nice reinforcement point. Because the one thing I hate to do is lose points. Love to get points, hate to lose points.
Right.
So I was actually using that as a core motivator for getting tasks done. That was my way of getting unstuck on tasks. If I had things sit too long, I saw my score dropping. I'm like, this isn't good. I don't want that. And that gave me that little competitive push against myself. Well, here's where I became stuck again. The gaps that they have in the ranks within Todoist at the lower stages are pretty close together to continue to reinforce. But once you get it to a high enough level, you have to complete 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 odd tasks before you see any significant increase. And it lost that motivating factor to me. I actually found myself going a week without going into Todoist and updating my tasks. Not that I wasn't getting stuff done. I just wasn't utilizing my system because I wasn't getting the feedback loop that I was originally counting on. I could go a week and lose points, and it wouldn't affect anything. So
Right.
When I look at that as a way of becoming stuck in this, it's because my system is doing exactly what I expected it to do, but it was also doing something else for me that I didn't realize that had taken over my personal motivation on getting things moving forward. And I look at that a lot when you look at like analog systems, you look at digital systems, anything like that. A lot of times people will be looking at these systems to provide that push, that reminder. I get it a lot in the professional space where people will ask about a business process system and they want an email reminder when they're supposed to do this, and an email reminder when they're supposed to do that, and an email reminder when they're supposed to do the next thing. And that's great, but there's going to be a point where you stop paying attention to those email reminders.
Notification fatigue sets in.
Exactly, and we get into that with all of our processes. People just, by their very nature, repetitive notifications, repetitive reminders will become blind to. So I'm looking at it from the standpoint, do I start to switch to another tool? So I picked up a tool that I've been using before, which is AnyDo, which has made some big improvements over the years, and started using it again. And here comes that motivator again. What's motivating me to use it? It doesn't have the gamification, but it's new to me. And being new to me gives me a little bit of a kick to go in and say, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to update that because I like to play with it now because it's new. A lot of people, new isn't the motivator. Just make it work. But I think when we look at this as a way to cross the hurdle, I'm recognizing that, especially for me, this new thing will only last so long. It's only going to go a few weeks, and then it's not going to be new anymore. So I have to evaluate the tool now, saying, after 4 weeks of using this, what's going to keep me using it? What aspects of it are going to keep drawing me back to that? And that applies to any system. But I want to circle back real quick to something we were actually talking about in the pre-show a little bit about this kind of ebb and flow of life. And I don't want to get too philosophical on this, but I think it's very relevant to what we're looking at here. Most people, when they look at productivity, they think productivity is a continuous flat line of execution or an increasing line of execution. If you were to graph it out, you're always going up the chart, hopefully. But that's not realistic. Productivity is a cyclic ebb and flow type of process. It's fluid. At times you will have high productivity, at times you will have low productivity. It always changes. So when we look at our systems, we have to recognize that what we perceive as being stuck may not actually be stuck. It may be just that trough in the wave that we're ready to come back up on. But if we get down in that trough and we recognize that we're never starting to have that swing back up, then we are truly stuck. And I know this is a big one for you, Ray. Metrics about this can be the motivator. Metrics can be the thing that push you up out of that hole. So tracking what you've gotten done and how much you've gotten done and being able to feel that, whether it's habit planners or task tools or whatever, getting that feedback can be enough often to get you moving forward again. I know that's what it usually does for me.
What's sort of interesting about Todoist is that, so I use a tool called Habitica, which is actually an RPG game online for developing habits. I've used it for quite some time, and I actually run a GTD community, what they call a party in Habitica, which used to be called Habit RPG for anybody listening. And it sounds sort of weird, but the Habit RPG became Habitica. Habitica is this game, and the reason I bring it up is that the karma, sort of construct that is in Todoist, Habitica has solved that problem by allowing you to reset your level. So once you reach level 100, they allow you to basically keep all of your sort of, energy and power and all these other sort of metrics that you've built up, these resources that you've built up, but you get to reset your level back down to level 1 so that you're able to actually change your roles. So there are the different roles, there are mages and warriors and all this other, fun stuff. But the idea is that, you reset yourself down to level 1 so that you can sort of regain and rekindle the motivation of building points that actually has a fast feedback loop, right? Because you're gaining lots of points really quickly for all of the work that you're doing. And I think that's kind of tantamount when it comes to personal productivity, dissimilar to skills mastery, right? Where skills acquisition, where you gain a particular level of acumen, doing another 100 hours of a particular skill becomes rather easy because you go into the flow state, this being in the zone state, as they talk about in psychology, that you're able to sort of have time melt away. You're very focused. You're developing new granular skills along this road to mastery. That's all really great, and it's very productive. But when it comes to actually tracking and maintaining a level of productivity, again, in line with what Art was talking about with regard to the ebbs and flows of your productive life, you also have to take into account the fact that when you hit a lull, the tool, if it's supposed to be motivating you through this gamification concept, then it needs to be able to be adaptive to that. It needs to be reflective of the fact that you're feeling stuck. What in it can make you more motivated. So if the folks over at the great company Doist, are listening, they should probably think about some way to have a sort of a reset button on the karma so that you're able to. And I forgive me if you guys already do, but the reality is, I think that's probably some component in there that you need some way to sort of shake up the apple cart so that you can get remotivated very quickly in it.
So to all the Skyrim players out there, we were being productive till we took an arrow to the knee. So now that we've got the Productivity Geek Game Cast out of the way.
Oh yeah, there's no level of that's going to go away over time.
This totally tees up what we were talking about what are our tricks to what's our pro tips on getting unstuck.
I wrote a three-part series on Medium complaining that that app designers, task management app designers, weren't doing enough gamification, and they weren't trying hard enough to engage users. They were sort of happy just to give you a bare bones database of tasks and giving you different ways to look at the tasks, but they weren't taking into account the fact that there's not much fun in just looking at a set of tasks. And there's so much more that if you set them aside, there's a lot more that we can do if we manage ourselves. And I think it has a lot to do with understanding kind of how humans work, but understanding what makes us work. Because at some point, if you master a game, you really don't want to go back and play the same game all over again. You want a new game. And sometimes new software brings along with it a whole new game. A different level allows you to play a different game. Giving you the ability to reset the level that you're at allows you to play a different game. But if you're the player, you can understand these mechanics and go past the software and actually invent these mechanics for yourself. It's not easy to do, and there's not a lot of help to do it, but if you can create your own games, then you're the one who is sort of in control. And if the company takes away the game, or if the app goes out of existence, you're still able to motivate yourself, because if you're the one designing the game, then it's intrinsically motivated as opposed to extrinsically motivated. And intrinsically is always better, because then you can move on to the next kind of game. It's just not easy to do. It has to do with really knowing yourself. I tried creating a game about 6 weeks ago. It had to do with using a calendar and following the calendar every day, or every minute of every day, just about. So far, I haven't been able to make it into turn the behavior into a permanent habit, just because I really don't know how to translate from the game I created, which relied on software, to intrinsic behaviors which don't rely on external software. So I don't have a permanent habit yet, but I'm still playing the game, but it's not enough to play the game and then not have the permanent behavior to go with it. So there's a subtle way in which you can use metrics to detect how well you're playing a game, but also there's sort of a very big game I try to play all the time, which segues right into this business of getting unstuck. And the big game I play is, what's the next upgrade for me to have in my system, to put in place? And earlier, Augusto said that it's difficult to sometimes detect when you need to make an upgrade or make a change in either a tool or a behavior. And I agree, it's really difficult to pay attention to sort of the small signals that tell you, ooh, I have to make a change. I have to look for a new program. I have to look for a new behavior. I have to go and find a new best-in-class skill or habit. To pay attention to sort of the early signals that tell us that it's time to start looking, it's time to start considering, it's time to start breaking down some behavior into small parts and then adapting them. That skill I find is very, very difficult, and most of us flounder. We bounce around thinking, if I get the next device, that'll do it for me, or if I read something on Google, if I read something on Medium, I'll pick up some new tip or next top 10 tips of something. But those things really don't develop that ability to upgrade your own system, and that's what we really need, I think.
I'm curious about the various tools that are available out there, not just digital tools, but all of the various techniques and strategies that are out there, so that people who may be coming from different backgrounds and different spaces can approach this. And I wanted to start off with a sort of a big one, which is a game, again, in this sort of gamification space. And so that people understand that we're really talking about gameplay from a perspective of productivity, not because it's going to be fun. Okay, so I need to clarify. Playing a game is not about necessarily it being fun. That is a byproduct of going into it. But what you do have to have is what's called a illusory attitude as it comes to gamification. Illusory attitude means that you accept the arbitrary rules of gameplay in order to be able to get into the game, right? So naturally, you're going to have points, right? You're going to have to do particular things in order for the game to go into play, and that's just a reality of it. To a great extent, I have going back to sort of Art's philosophical discussion here, I sort of have a problem with the idea of using the term gamification, gameplay, rules, play, all of those things, purely because it sounds less serious, right? It's sort of like, I use the task manager, Remember the Milk. It is a fairly, it's a game, it's a task manager of levity, right? We have a cow as a logo, the Bob T. Monkey is our mascot, and it's a fairly fun, comical brand. But it's a fantastic task manager, and some people won't use it because it doesn't seem quote unquote professional enough for them, and that doesn't bother me. I have no problem with the fact that it's one of the best task managers out there as a GTD practitioner, and I use it. And so this idea of gameplay, I think, has a branding problem, and gamification has a branding problem, because I think that employers, corporate enterprise, has a problem with the idea of their employees playing a game. So for those who might be listening, just ignore the terminology, use the underpinning, use the infrastructure for greater productivity. And that is to say, if we can use these gamification tools, then we can really be much more productive. And so, getting to my point, though, which was that there's a program out there that was developed by Dr. Jane McGonigal called Super Better. And Dr. McGonigal is a game. She has a PhD, I think, in game design and as a neuroscientist. And she has developed this program. And there is a mobile application for it. There's a very strong community at Super Better. And she wrote a book about Super Better. And so I highly recommend that you read the book, because if you want to develop this game for yourself, she gives you all the fundamental components to be able to develop the game. And you're developing your own game in essence, because you don't need to play somebody else's game necessarily. You really need to create one that is bespoke to the needs of your life so that you can get unstuck. And she really helps you build resilience and all kinds of other really strong psychological factors that help you get out of being stuck and continually stay in that state of unstuckness to the level that you can. So that's one option.
I'll jump in on the analog side, just because I love my analog stuff too. A couple of things that you'll hear on the analog side. You'll hear about habit trackers. Often it's related to health things, but just things in general where you're looking for repeat processes. Jerry Seinfeld is actually a big advocate of using a calendar as a habit tracker and having a repeat cycle of just tracking the execution of a specific activity so it develops into a habit. Unfortunately, a lot of habit trackers can wind up feeling to be as much work as the task that they're supposed to be. If we take something as simple as making sure you drink 8 glasses of water a day, if that's something you prescribe to, using a habit tracker to track that can give you that kind of little kick in the shorts to keep that moving forward. But it also becomes work because you're like, oh, I'm at 6, I got to do 2 more. So balancing an analog-based habit tracker with a reward system that works for you can be a great way to get you unstuck on things. To be able to say, okay, I'm going to be able to go through and do this, complete this activity, and every time I complete this activity that needs to be done, I'm going to track it in my habit tracker. And once I'm able to do that successfully on time for whatever period that I've allocated, I'm going to get this reward for myself. And I have to go back to what you said, Ray, about this branding issue around gamification, because you're absolutely right. There is within the corporate space this hesitance. It's kind of a dichotomy because there's popularity around the terminology and the concept of gamification. It's this cool thing to do until you actually try to start doing it with people, because then they go, oh, no, that's not professional. That's silly. We're not going to do that. And they turn it into the classic staffing evaluation type of methodology. And it even comes down to the phrases that people will use. The phrase gaming the system is a negative phrase in connotation.
Right.
But if you spin it and turn the systems into something where there's positive reinforcement throughout their life cycle, whether it's analog, whether it's digital, regardless, that positive reinforcement can help people get unstuck and help the flow continue. So the trick I use on the analog side is if you are like me and you keep a bullet journal of various forms and you have day pages in it, hide a Post-it note later on in your day pages, like a week later, as a reward to completing all the note tracking up to that point. And if you reach that point and say, hey, that's cool, I got my reward, you know then at least you've kept your progress going. That's that achievement unlocked. And I use that just on the analog side, hide little reminders to myself and successes that I'm able to then, feel good about what I've been able to do and keep the ball moving forward.
There's one thing I want to add to that, and I do something similar to that. And I have a context that I call questions, or questions that I ponder. Okay, and it comes from things that I want to reflect. And there are moments, for example, so shared at the beginning of the show, so I was doing my review this weekend, I uncovered, over 900 tasks. Okay. And I understand I've been on a creator crazy busy mode. So I know where all that is coming and it's fine. I now need to polish my system in order for the system to digest all that and then being able to produce the results. But it comes to the question if there is something better I can do about getting to this point. So could I have, noticed the chaos or the stuckness on the task number 500 or need to get to the 1,000? And I don't know the answer to that. But what I have done for many years is I go to this context and ask the question and then put it 3, 6, and 9 months out. I created 3 tasks, put it there, hide it, and set the system so it hide it until that. Because in 3 months, most likely I will have forget about it. But as soon as the question comes out, then I will be able to see at the problem in retrospective with a completely different level of clarity. And same thing if I go 6 months, and same thing if I go 9 months. Even there are moments, especially when I ruminate a lot about it, that I even create on my journal application and a specific tag and then put the tag into this reminder so that way it's a clue for me to go back to the journal and read back what I've been thinking about it and what was the thinking 3, 6 months back, because it allows me to see patterns that I was simply unable to see at the moment everything was happening. If you ask about, when we talk about all these trackers, I have used them all. I have tried them all, and I have tried them in many different ways with different level of failure. I wish to tell different level of success, but it's actually a different level of failure in my particular case. But when I have finally been done with them and move on and keep this question and then come back and revisit them 3 months later or 6 months later and say, yeah, this was the reason this was failing. So if ever I decide to try it again, and I have, I need to pay attention to these things so I don't make these same mistakes and I try to make new ones.
I wanted to bring up an application that I have seen several people in my community sort of using and really appreciating, which is an app called Unstuck, and it's a free application. And what happens is, or how it works, is that it acts as sort of a digital coach for helping you get unstuck. And there'll be a link to that in the show notes for this episode. And the way it works is that, you sort of come to a stuck moment, and then you try to figure out how you're stuck, and it gives you different reasons for being stuck. Being that one option is that you're acting like a tunnel visionary, they call it. Do you need to take your blinders off? Are you acting like an ad-libber? Are you faking it instead of making it? Are you being an avoider? And what do you keep doing, that putting off, that you should be doing right now? And so you choose these mechanisms, these answers to these questions, to get you to a place where then you can take action to overcome those particular points. And with that plan, that work plan, now you can now start to get motivated and deal with the changes that are necessary in order to get back to being productive. So just so you know, there are applications out there like this that can be very, very useful. It's sort of genius in its simplicity, in that it just takes you through this workflow of getting you from a place of feeling stuck to getting unstuck. So just know that that's out there.
I use a version of, in terms of practical approaches, a version of Tim Ferriss's deconstruction of expert performance process, I guess. And I discovered it after I wrote my book and thought, boy, I should have included this because it would have made some things clearer. But as you guys probably know, he goes around and he chases down the best performers in any particular area or niche, and then he does what he calls DSSC, which is, I'm looking at the website, deconstruction, selection, sequencing, and stakes. But essentially what he's doing is he's looking to find the inner workings of a high performing skill or habit. And that's something I try to do also. If I read about someone who's having success doing something I've never considered or thought about and therefore don't do, I try to follow a process similar to the one he described, where I try to figure out what are the behaviors that, observable behaviors that actually physically take place that underlie this particular habit or practice. So it's a bit tedious because it takes a bit of work to try and find out what the underlying behaviors are. And sometimes I can't even find out based on the description that's been given. That converting a high-level behavior into its smallest component parts so I can then try them together and see if they work. That's one tool I use.
The way in which I get unstuck typically is through sensory stimulation, not necessarily overstimulation, but I really do believe in stimulating all senses in order to bring my system back online. It's sort of a reset. But I try to touch all of my primary five senses. So those of you who don't know, we have more than five senses, but the five typical that we talk about. What I really try to do is try to engage all five senses in whatever it is that I'm attempting to do. And I think that's really important in the course of your day. You don't particularly think about all of those things, but what I'll do is I will actually say, okay, well, it's time for me to just do some pausing and planning, and I will find all the things that will engage me, whether that be the right scent. Citrus has a tendency to really engage me and, sort of wake me up. And so that'll engage my olfactory senses. I'll be able to have an apple or something that will help be crunchy and fun and get my tactical and my taste systems in place, engaged. All of those senses, getting up and walking, anything that's going to get me engaged with all of my senses in and toward whatever it is that I need to do, even if that's a minor deviation from the thing that it is that needs to be done, right? So taking a walk, but it also gives me a sense of space away from what it is so that I can think about, well, what is it that I need to really do here? Am I doing the wrong or right actions toward the outcome that I'm looking for? So I just think that engaging all of your senses is a really good practice for getting unstuck.
For me, I kind of cheat a little bit with my task list. What I do is anytime I see a task that fits two criteria, one that's not part of the critical time path of things that need to be executed, but it still needs to be done. And second, if the task can be completed in 10 to 15 minutes, if it meets those two criteria, I will tag it with the tag Kickstart. And what that does is that it has no bearing on the actual project execution, but it helps me get out of the trough, because what I can do then is I can go back, and if I feel like I'm stuck, I can do a search for Kickstart, find a task that I know I can get done quickly and that will help move the ball forward. It doesn't matter when I get it done, just as long as it gets done, and go ahead and do it. And usually I can do one or two of those. If I'm doing Pomodoro sprints, I can do two of them within a sprint to feel like I'm accomplishing something again and get rolling forward. But by hiding those in my list, I know I always have them available. It's kind of like the little bag of candy in your desk drawer. If you need something real quick, you pop it out, pop it in your mouth, and keep going. Same thing here. I mean, these are little task suites that I hide for myself to be able to get it and get moving forward.
I do a couple of things. One of them is once a month, I do what I call a low priority day. And I plan it, block my calendar, and it's a day where I do only low priority stuff that has zero importance and otherwise will never get done. And what that allows, believe it or not, is remove a lot of junk out of the system. And junk on the sense is stuff that anyways I need to do. Okay, but because it's low priority, low importance, low everything, it just stays on your system way too long. And it is like, if you allow me the analogy, it's like some stuff on your fridge. You open your fridge and see it on the back of your eye and say, oh, I need to clean that Tupperware. Close the fridge as fast as you humanly can. So the connection doesn't come to the brain say, oh, do it right now. So you close the fridge. And it is the same thing on your system. There are certain things that are low priority, low importance, that then stay there for way too long. Okay, that what it does is, one, annoy yourself every time you see them, but second, makes you less efficient, because what happens is you start creating resistance towards opening your system. The second thing I do is similar to this Kickstarter idea. I have this backlog idea. So when I get to reviews like the one I have yesterday, where I had 963 tasks, there is no way I can, be, even if I do, focus on nothing else other than that this week, to be able to be good by Friday. So what means is I need to go and look on those tasks from a different perspective and a more critical one, and then start working into removing some of these lower important things out of the context that I'm looking at, and then blocking time on my calendar to get rid of this backlog. So what I tend to do is I try to create blocks of an hour into my calendar, as many as I humanly can, and then work into that backlog to get it clean, and keeping on what I will call the active system, quote unquote, and context, the stuff that is time sensitive. Because what happens when you get to a certain level of task, like I'm just describing, is you get a really hard time identifying what is time sensitive and what is not. And you tend to avoid getting into the system because of emotional factors. So taking the time to move a lot of stuff out of your usual context to this backlog and putting a time where you are going to clean it up allows your unconscious to say, okay, well, yes, we are overwhelmed. Yes, we have more stuff than we should have, but there is a plan and there's organized stuff. And there's something there that suddenly gained more importance or more priority than what I originally thought when I did the evaluation. I know exactly where to go to find it, retrieve it, and move it to a different place.
I like that. I like the idea of recalibration.
To give some more details about what I do to deconstruct the behavior. So after I've read about it a bit, or as much as I can, I use a common tool, mind mapping, to figure out what the component behaviors are. I use the rule that the behavior has to be something that's observable by a video camera, so it has to be available to the naked eye, so not psychological, all observable. And then I use a modified sort of issue tree, where I take the behavior and break it down into its parts, and I ask the question, is this the minimum set of behaviors that are required in order to produce the grand behavior? Minimum number of small behaviors required to produce the grand behavior. So I use those two tools in tandem.
And I have placed the YouTube video where Tim Ferriss walks people through this, and a link to that system in the show notes, so folks can go ahead and check that out. So thank you guys. This has been a fantastic episode for talking about getting unstuck. I feel like people can now approach the stuckness, identifying, awareness of being stuck, and using tactics like novelty and rewards, which folks know I'm a pretty big fan of positive behavioral interventions. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about ends up being very, very powerful for those who do feel stuck and want to get unstuck. So this closes out another episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. And so thank you guys for joining me here on the show today.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.